today joining me is Shaka Mitchell. Um, I'm excited to have him, a TEDx speaker. He created the Come Together Music Project, which I love. I actually have a candidate for Florida House of Representative. His name is Banks Helfrich, and he was having meetings. And when the discussions got kind of contentious, he would start music and start dancing. So I saw him do that a few times, and it really eases the moment because we are in a time and a place in America where things can get pretty heated. So and that's something I'm really trying to develop an understanding from every side and every perspective on how we could just bring America back together. Yesterday when I was talking to somebody, it just came up. I said, I remember the days when a justice like Sandra Day O'Connor would get confirmed with 99 votes in the Senate. I was like, and now you're lucky. The high water mark is 52 if you get a confirmation hearing at all. And so I want to get back to those days where we understand we're going to have differences, but let's try to work together and get through a lot of stuff. So, Shaka, I want you to jump right in. So you're an Aspen Institute Civil Society fellow. You've spent years facilitating conversations where opposing views rub elbows, whether in policy debates or community settings, which is what I try to do now. That's really what I try to do now. And we do tackle important issues, but the most important issue I want to touch base with you, and I'm going to let you jump right in, is education reform. There is so much to be said about that. And there is so much good thinking on that topic from so many people I've already interviewed that I just want to keep it up. I just want to keep talking about it. So jump in,
Great,
Shaka.
great. Well, Jeff, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate what you're doing and letting me come on the podcast, have a conversation with you. Because yeah, like you're saying, we need to regain the skill of having conversations with one another, and even if we don't agree on 100% of the things, which by the way is just real life, right? We don't agree on 100% of the things with our best friends, with our spouses, even. So we've got to retrain, ourselves to be able to stay in these conversations, to stick around with each other, and hopefully come out the other side being better for it. I think our country will be better for it. I think our children are going to be better for it. So, yeah, I really appreciate you having me on, and I'm happy to talk about all things, education, music related. We'll just see where the conversation goes. But, on the education front, like you said, I'm a senior fellow at the American Federation for Children. Our goal is really to make sure that all children, especially those from low income families, have access to the education that best meets their needs. So we're a national nonprofit, and we spend our time just trying to figure out, all right, how do we get laws in place that allow dollars to follow scholars, that allow kids to go to the school of best fit. And we don't really care if that's a private school, a public charter school, a zone school, a magnet, homeschool, whatever. We don't really care because we just know that there are lots of needs. And of course, there's lots of needs because there's lots of kids. I've got three. We were just talking before we started recording, talking about our own kids, and I've got three. It's just after school drop off time, so took them to school. They are very similar in some ways, but also super different, right? And their learning needs are different. The things that they are drawn to, the subjects that they're drawn to are different. How they like to learn. I got an early riser. I got a night owl. I got you know, and that's just what happens even just within one family. Now imagine when you have 52 million children across America, it can't be the case that one system is going to work best for all those children. So our goal is really, finding the best fit, making sure that the laws allow parents to find those choices wherever they can.
Well, that's beautiful. And let me tell you, one thing you said was our children will be able to afford it. I also think our children are going to be better at it. We are in a time and place in America. We are not doing well as far as coming together. There is the divide, the chasm is growing wider and wider.
For sure.
That's going to change. I think everybody needs to realize that's going to change. We're in a cycle. The economy has its crazy gyrations, and so does what's going. I I don't blame it all on what's going on. The White House. I don't blame it all on the president of the White House. I think there were people who were frustrated for the longest time, and this is the guy that's doing the heavy lifting that they've all been waiting for. And so that's their right to have that opinion. My personal view, it's too much, too fast, too aggressive, too scattered. It's concerning, but the fact of the matter is there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of gold at the end of that rainbow, however we get there. And this is how we're going to get there, is having a discussion. The biggest thing is education. The biggest thing is the old saying, I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I know who holds tomorrow.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing. Yesterday, I had Jackson Lahamer, who is a key member of the White House Faith Council. We were talking about a lot of things. One of the things said he would, well, the churches in America are some of the most underutilized buildings in America, and they could do so much more. So as far as education, I was talking about how, and I don't know if you have an opinion, share it. I was talking about how so many kids have food insecurity in their life, and how that can really create long-term problems and even lead to a life of crime. Kids are growing up without even breakfast, and then roaming the streets at night without dinner, and a little bit of the the little bit of lunch they get during their school day is just really not meeting their needs as far as.
Hmm.
So when we think about education, what would some kind of program where we really invested in public school nutrition or charter school nutrition or private school nutrition, would that make a difference in children's lives? Have you
Yeah.
ever?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the observation is right on point in terms of um, the effect that food insecurity has on the ability to learn, the ability to focus, right? For kids to really be their best selves and bring their best selves into the school environment and the learning day. But I'll give you kind of a bit of a counter to that. And this is from some of my days as a charter school administrator in Nashville. Um, One of the things that I saw is that the district where I live, Metro Nashville Public Schools, was often, I would say, trying to do too much. And so there was a school where we started a school, and by the way, this links to where you first started. We leased space from a church because, the church was basically unoccupied, or this big building was unoccupied 6 days a week. And we said, well, hey, we would love to use this. They had the Sunday school rooms, and it was a great setup. It was a great partnership. And so we opened in a church in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Nashville, in North Nashville. And so that was a great partnership. The closest zoned public school had a whole food pantry, and on Fridays, many times they would send kids home, with groceries, right, to kind of make it through the weekend. And listen, I absolutely applaud that. Um, the heart is in the right place for sure, like no doubt about that. But one of the social workers actually told me an interesting story. He said that one of the unintended consequences of them sending kids home with food is that this was in elementary school. He said that they then saw an increase in the number of students who came back to school with burns and having been treated for burns, because now you had elementary school kids trying to cook things on a stovetop and they weren't ready for it, and they were doing it unsupervised. And he was like, so then we found out that because of our food pantry, now we needed more healthcare services to kind of clean up for that. And I thought, wow, I had never really thought about kind of the ripple effects, right? And so I say that to say, I think that the impulse is totally right, but you often hear from a lot of teachers where they feel like, hey, I'm being asked to do so much more, and I don't have time to do it. I don't have the expertise to do it, and I really sympathize with that. And so I'm kind of the mindset that schools have got to do the first thing really well before they start expanding too quickly into all these other domains. So like, and we're not. I would say we're not doing those first things, those basic things, really well just yet. So that's kind of my hesitancy about trying to do too much. But lots of community organizations, we should absolutely have partnerships with community orgs and whatnot in the area to make sure we're taking care of our kids and kind of with those wraparound services.
So absolutely, this is a great thing you just pointed out, that there are consequences, and that was something we didn't cover yesterday. When I was talking to Jackson, what we did cover inadvertently, I guess it would be inadvertent to the consequences you just described, was schools are doing enough. I don't know that they're doing it well, but they do have their plate full. The K through 12
Yeah.
education docket's pretty full. And then you've always got the pushback from that the teachers union is one of the strongest union in the world, and not a lot's going to change as far as the other than when we've gone to the innovative approach of charter schools, which generally, so I'm going into two different directions here, but for a moment I'm going to make that point. Charter schools have a great result, but generally they get to handpick their kids, so you're really hedging your bet there. So, but what I always thought about, and I think about it a lot, is like Jackson Lim said, we've got these buildings. You utilized one, which was a great tool. That they do more of the stuff that the schools can't get to.
Hmm.
That in those buildings, and I believe it should be churches. I want to combine community and church. There is a separation between church and state, but there's also a cooperation between church and state. So when we talk about what the churches could do in these great facilities that are, like you said, only really being used on Sundays and sometimes on Wednesdays and whatever Christmas falls on, there's a lot of empty days. Um, what if they created, and if it was funded somehow, programs to teach kids how to cook, to teach kids life skills. One of the books that came up in yesterday's interview with Jackson Lahamar was Robert Kiyosaki's book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, where he talks about how you should know so many important things like about taxes and insurance and
Right.
investing and working
Right.
for money and making money work for you. If the churches could teach our kids that stuff over and above the K through 12 curriculum, if the kids literally voluntarily showed up at some of these extracurricular courses at the churches. Not so much reinventing our K through 12 education system, but building on it, utilizing time that kids would otherwise be playing video games.
Right, right. No, I'm all for that. And, I can think of a guy in town. He runs a great kind of financial preparation curriculum kind of course for kids, and he does it actually for adults also, right? So he's got to make a living and earn a living somehow as well. So he's got a whole like program that he can do for adults and whatnot. But a big part of his mission is to do it for kids, kind of as like after school programming and just teaching financial literacy. I'm right, and it's something that I bet you're doing it with yours. It's something that I'm doing or attempting to do with mine. I think it's a lot harder now that they don't use cash and everybody can just pay with their phone, whatever. It doesn't feel like real money. But um, but yeah, some of those lessons are so important, and I do think that yeah, teachers had their plate full, and so yeah, I'm totally sympathetic to like uh, the math teacher who says, "Hey, I went to school so that I could teach math." And by the way, I love math and I love teaching, and I want to share my passion with kids for this academic skill. Why in the world am I also trying to become a trained financial planner and a sous chef and a healthcare worker and a mental health social welfare kind of social worker? Like, yeah, just be a math teacher. We need great math teachers, and then yeah, let's figure out the other component parts with other organizations for sure.
And make it voluntary. And I even went so far as saying, and granted, this is all just like some people say I'm just naive, but I went so far as saying they make it even incentive based. If these kids show up at these courses, granted, there may be this incredible dinner. And I think it's important kids eat off real plates and real glassware and real silverware. I don't necessarily agree with the idea of a paper plate is just fine, but that's okay. I got wiggle room on that one. Um, but if they showed up and it was incentive based, so just hypothetically speaking, not building up one company over another, it just they did enough, they graduated, they met the expectations of this life skills course, like we just described, and they received a $50 gift card to Amazon for doing so. And I understand people say, "Oh yeah, where are we going to get the money?" Well, there is a lot of money out there. There's a lot of money
Hmm.
out there.
Hmm.
I'm not going to pick on particular instances what we sent Ukraine or what we're spending on remodeling the White House, but there's a lot of money out there. So
Yeah.
when we say where's the money, the money's there. It's the idea of getting the point across that is this crazy investment. And sometimes the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation says if we're not failing enough, we're not swinging the bat hard enough. There's plenty of money out there to swing the bat really hard. There's plenty of money out there for epic fails, false starts, and great success stories in the end. And I really think the return on investment would be huge if we created this kind of national momentum. And
Yeah,
so, as much as as often as I'm sometimes at odds with the current administration, he is the guy that swings the bat harder than anybody. Just like Reggie Jackson had more strikeouts than anybody, but he also had more home runs than many. I want to create this innovation and this new thinking of what can we do differently. And I just think you're a big part of that. Everybody I bring on suddenly, this conversation seems to revert back to some of this stuff. Everybody seems to have a sense of interest in it.
yeah. I was at this conference just a few weeks ago up at Harvard. It's called the Emerging School Models Conference, and I was on a panel. We were talking about in this new ecosystem where there are options that you and I just didn't have, right? I mean, for where I grew up, it was the neighborhood zone school, which was not a great school. I grew up on Long Island,
I grew up
New
on Long
York.
Island.
Oh, how
What
about that? Yeah,
part?
in Hempstead,
I
Hempstead.
grew up in Levittown.
Yeah, how about that? Yeah. Okay.
Wow.
So I mean, Hempstead High School was sort of notoriously bad, right? Um, just not a great school academically, not a safe school. So it was that. It was a Catholic school, which is what my siblings and I did. We got a discount for being part of the parish, whatever, and went to a school in Uniondale. it, those were kind of the options, right? So you could either pay for it out of pocket, and my parents worked for the post office. They didn't have a lot of means, but we sacrificed, and they made it happen for us so that we could do it. And I do believe that education made the difference for me, for my sister, my brother. Um, but anyway, today's educational ecosystem totally different. Now you've got charter schools; those didn't exist then. Now you've got private choice programs, whether it's tax credit scholarships or vouchers or ESAs. You've the homeschool community. During COVID, the largest growth sector was African American homeschoolers, um, because lots of folks were opting out of the system and saying, "Hey, I think we can actually figure this out on our own, maybe with some help from some state financial resources, whatever." So now this whole ecosystem has changed. So I'm up at Harvard, and we're talking about, all right, well, how do we um, analyze the quality of the options that are out there, and whether or not, what do we tell parents? What are parents interested in? What metrics can we use? One guy, to your point, had a really interesting idea. He was talking about students being able to earn basically like digital, almost like an NFT, but like digital badges, kind of like they do when they play video games. You play and you kind of get to a certain level and you get you kind of unlock a new thing, right? Unlock a new ability. And he said, okay, what if kids had a digital wallet to sort of incentivize them earning these, gaining these new skills, and then they're earning these badges, whatever, but then they can actually show later on, maybe to an employer or what have you, like, hey, look, these are some marketable skills, right? Like so it's basically a certificate process, right? It's like a certification. You kind of get a paper and you say this, but sort of doing it in a way that's more modern. And I thought, all right, like, I don't know if that's going to be wildly successful, but let's try, right? And I appreciated that there's people in different sectors now trying to, sort of trying to take a bite of this elephant, one bite at a time, so that we can finally, do right by our kids.
That's an incredible, just like, so I brought up the idea of Amazon gift card. Then there's this digital resume essentially that the kids are building at a young age. And what's fascinating about the digital resume over and above my idea is I read a book from Charles Koch. It was it was the ground up. And he had wrote about how companies are hiring the best from the best schools. and they're it's a pedigree system basically.
Yeah.
You've got the best schools and the best students and the best candidates for the job. They get to the job, they're ready for the job, but it's the communication with the other companies and the employees and all these basic skills they just don't have. And companies are investing a ton of money just getting them up to speed on basic skills. Yeah, they can do all the algorithms. Yeah, they're all up on AI. Yeah, they're ready to hit their computer hard, but when it comes to I guess picking up the phone or typing an email, they don't have the skills. And that would be an incredible way to do it, where you're literally building your resume from maybe the grade 7 up, I mean, or even grade 6 up, where you're learning important stuff. And the same way, and then you decide what interests you.
Hmm.
If you're learning how to work in a hospital from a young age, and then you're literally in front of the chief of the hospital, showing him your younger resume, how you built your young resume to the point where you're ready for this job. That's just an incredible approach.
Yeah, well, and I love it because it's more skills based and it's kind of mastery based. We sort of use that term in education rather than what we've got now, which is mostly time based, right? Like, you ever think about that? The only reason that you were in classes with the people you were in class with is because you happened to be born within the same like 10-month period. It's it's kind of an arbitrary thing, right? With now knowing what we know about brain development, frankly, you think about, for most of us, just because you were good in one subject doesn't necessarily mean that you were good in another subject, right? I mean, you can be I saw this with my own kids. You can be great in a great reader, great in English language arts, and really struggle in math. But based on the way we do it right now, we say, "Oh, well, too bad. You're still going to be in the same
Right.
class, in the same level with the same kids because you happen to be born in the same half of a year in, you know, 2015 or whatever." It's not mastery based, and so I think you're seeing some more flexible models now that are mastery based, and it's really pushing a lot of public schools to kind of innovate. I mean, we see this. I would actually say you're in the state where we see this most strongly in Florida, because there's been some studies that have come out that showed that for kids, Florida's got an amazing choice ecosystem, right? I mean, the education savings accounts, you've had vouchers, you've had tax credits for 25 years at this point. So um, there's something like 500,000 students participate in a private choice program in Florida. Another 400,000 or so participate in charter schools. So that's almost a million kids out of 3 million or so. So it's really tremendous. But here's the stat: for the kids who remain in public schools, the kids who remain in public schools but have more exposure to competition, those kids actually do better than when there's no exposure to competition. Isn't that interesting? And
Yeah.
and so that to me says, like, okay, that means that their public schools are kind of looking around and saying, hey, what are they doing? What are they doing across the street, or what are they doing down the street that maybe we can replicate, maybe we can do inside our building, so that everybody does well? Because I just don't believe that education is a zero sum game.
No.
Every school can be better.
Absolutely. And like you said, when they're looking at one each other's results and they're comparing and they're trying to beat, I guess basically beat one another, there is that. My kids actually went to private school for years. And then I moved them to a charter school, which they like more, but it is harder. It is significantly harder. The private school was not what it was not the challenging it was not as challenging as I thought it would be for them. When we moved into charter school, it was significantly more challenging, and they withstood the challenge. They did it. They're doing
Awesome.
great. So, um, but like you said, it's not one size fits all for anything, and we are in Florida analyzing some of that, and I can't um we're do Florida is really building on its education program. Just like you said, I think Massachusetts is another gold star of public education. But I mean, to get to the point where all 50 states are really hitting those high notes, I think is going to take a lot. So then, okay, so now we got this new the I guess you could say the Department of Education's gone. You've got all these great educators that were essentially laid off. I guess is I don't know. I guess Congress has to finalize the decision. But how do we now make this? I've pointed out that Ronald Reagan talked about closing the Department of Education, and ultimately it grew in size and scope on his 8-year tenure.
Right.
Then we've literally closed it. I believe it's done. How do we utilize these educators that were working in that building? Is there any way to get them going and start working on improving our national education system?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll tell you, there is one thing that I'll come back to. Is this a new federal tax credit program? And so it's related to education, but it's actually coming out of the Department of Treasury, which is pretty interesting. And I think there's some reasons for optimism there. In terms of what to do with all the people from the US Department of Education, I, I think this is one of the reasons that the administration has been, and Secretary McMahon, has been so, um, I think, eager to downsize, is because you you actually don't have a whole lot of teachers at the U.S. Department of Education. You have a lot of like paper pushers at the U.S. Department of Education, right? I mean, the U.S. Department of Education, one, it only accounts for maybe 10, 11% of education funding across the country. Most education funding is local and state dollars. What it accounts for, though, is a whole lot of the paperwork and compliance stuff. And I would say that like I feel about education compliance very similarly to how I feel about the DMV, which is to say, um, I noticed that most bad drivers on the road still have licenses, right? The license doesn't equal a uh, a skill. It doesn't mean that like there's a very high bar. I'm even teaching. I've got a 15-year-old, and so we are teaching her how to drive now, and I'm kind of like, all right, like Lord, we're gonna need your help because this we got a long way to go. Right now, she's just not a great driver, but she could get a license, um,
She'll
right?
pass.
She is passable. Now, I'm not comfortable with her driving yet, so I'm not going to unleash her on the roads for my neighbor's sake yet, and for her sake. But it's all to say, I think sometimes we can equate compliance with quality. And that's what the Department of Education, in my opinion, it's been too much of that. Now, that being said, I also think for the ones who are educators, because you've got some folks who are at the U.S. Department of Ed, they're smart, policy people, whatever. Maybe they do want to get back in the classroom in some capacity, got good ideas. Um, the number of kids that we serve hasn't changed. So I sort of think that, it's a little bit like water. You want to, like the Bruce Lee quote, be like water, right? Because you want to flow where you're needed and where there's the least pressure. And so the same way that if you think about what happens to the teachers if a public school closes? Well, if a public school closes, those kids have to go somewhere. They're still going to need teachers, right? And so at some point, these things kind of even out. So I'm not all that concerned. I hope that doesn't sound callous. I'm not all that concerned with personnel at the Department of Ed because I think that on net, where we just haven't seen a whole lot of return on the investment from that particular from most of the functions that they're doing at U.S. Department of Ed. Yeah.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I don't think there was a lot of I don't think there was a lot of return for what the U.S. It's another just big government agency. One of the things you pointed out was one of the concerns was when you close the Department of Education, who's going to handle the school loans? And I think that did wind up in the IRS, in the Treasury Department's hands. I think they are going to execute the recovery or the collection of
Yeah, I think they're
school
going to do
loans.
some school loan stuff. Yeah,
So
yeah,
that big chore was moved over to them. So if you consolidated two departments, if I guess if you got more work out of government employees in one, I guess that's an efficient. And if you weren't getting a lot out of the other agency, my point is like you said, they may not necessarily be teachers, but at this point in time, they have an understanding of education and just wondering if there's a way to take I guess when they say when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. If there's a way to take these people, because my feeling is America is ready for an education renaissance. An education renaissance. We're ready for a change. It doesn't have to be overnight, but there's a lot of good thinking out. When I bring up the topic, I get a lot of great thinkers telling me, just like you said, that electronic building your electronic resume, your life skills, and
Hmm.
all that. It's out there. So how do we keep it growing? How do we keep
Hmm.
it? And
Hmm.
I just thought maybe those people would be a big part of that initiative.
Yeah. Maybe so. I mean, I think that's a hopeful way to think about it. And these are folks who have seen like how to administer programs in that are national in scope, right? So to the effect that we're trying to take something that's maybe working in your backyard or my backyard, whatever, and we're saying, hey, how do we scale this so that it's not just a benefit for 30 kids, but for 30,000, right? To the extent that the U.S. Department of Ed has thinkers like that, I think they're going to be in high demand because there are a whole lot of organizations now that are doing some innovative things, but it's at a really micro scale, and we're trying to figure out how to grow them. The thing that I was referring to also that went to Treasury is that there is a new federal tax credit scholarship program that passed. A federal tax credit scholarship program. It passed as part of the big beautiful bill, and this thing, what it's going to allow, and so many states have had one of these at the state level for years. So Florida has had one of these for a long time. Indiana, Arizona, there's a number of states that have had these, more than 15, I believe. And it basically what it does is if you had uh, tax liability, you could make a contribution instead of paying the tax to the government. You could give it to a scholarship granting organization, and then the scholarship granting organization gives scholarships, right, to kids and whatever. It might have a mission. It might say, okay, we're a Catholic organization. We're gonna give to kids who want to attend Catholic schools, or we are going to give to kids who live in rural communities, or whatever the mission is. So that passed. This is the first time that that's happened at the federal level. So there's been state-based programs, but you've never been able to get a tax credit for a contribution to a scholarship organization on your federal income taxes. So now that opens up the game to all 50 states, right? So now, even if you don't have one of these programs in your state, uh, a state-based program, now you can contribute to the federal program. It's a big deal, and so I've seen some estimates. I'm looking at my other computer here, but or other screen here. I've seen some estimates of how much money this could raise if in Florida, if 1% of the eligible taxpayers participated in this program. And by the way, to me, it's a no brainer. Kind of um, you know title of your podcast, but so I'm stealing that. But it's a no brainer because you've got this tax liability anyway, right? You have to pay this money to the IRS. So why wouldn't you just redirect some of it to a scholarship organization? Because it's a dollar for dollar credit. So it's not like a donation to a nonprofit. It's dollar for dollar. If 1% did it in Florida, it would be $50 million annually into scholarships. And so that's a big deal. So that means if 15% participation, $750 million into
Just in
scholarships
Florida.
just in Florida.
Right.
Just in Florida. And then those scholarships can go to kids even in public schools, charter schools, private schools, homeschool. Um, and they can use them, you can use the money like you would be able to in an education savings account program. So you can use it on tuition, you could use it on textbooks and, educational materials, that kind of stuff. This could be a game changer because we're talking about nationally, you're talking about billions of dollars.
Yeah, I think that would be huge. And just like you said, that's what I'm looking for is this notion of billions of dollars of investment in education. I just see it, you know, So one of the things we keep talking about is jobs going overseas, right? And we keep saying that things are changing. Warren Buffett said the reason that the divide, that the chasm between rich and poor has grown is because life has gotten more complicated. 300 years ago, everybody was a farmer, and everybody had the same skills and had the same skills to achieve an income. So the point is that jobs are not just going overseas. There's automation that's taking jobs away. I knew I had a friend that was a single mom, and she worked at the toll booths. I mean, she was literally a supervisor. There's a tunnel under some of the bigger toll booths. She was bringing cashiers their cash drawers and giving people their breaks. That toll booth has been taken down.
Hmm.
It's now electronic. You just
Because you
have
don't
an
need people.
e-pass.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
those jobs have gone away, and on and on and on and on. We could use 1,000 examples of how the jobs are just going away. So the idea of what I keep building on is a part of education reform being investment, being somehow learning a job that you're going to keep again. And that part of those billions, like you said, those scholarships that could send kids to additional programs would be incredible. But the fact that, like you said, it's kind of my feeling is the fact that we're doing these baby steps when in fact things are changing at leaps and bounds. When we're training people for these changes in such a small way, but the changes are happening in such a big way, we're really going against the curve here. We're going to have a lot of people uh, not doing well in the future, and that's a concern of mine. I don't think we need more social programs. I think we need more education.
Well, and one of the things that I think is really important, and unfortunately, a lot of schools have a hard time teaching this. Particularly, I will say, a lot of public schools have a hard time teaching this because often they're trying to do too much. Sometimes, dependent upon the politics of the area, you there's no consensus. But what schools ought to be doing, in addition to teaching some of the academic core academic skills, right, is teaching what's called like durable skills. And these are the skills that will last somebody for a lifetime. So you and I were talking earlier about um, what Coke was talking about, the ability to communicate internally with your colleagues and externally, whether it's with customers or other service providers, right? And I see this with my own kids where sometimes I'll say, "Hey, why don't you just call that business and ask them the question?" Everybody want to like look it up, and if it's not in the first three Google search, items, then it must not exist. And I say, "No, sometimes you just can't find it online. Call the phone, speak to a person, and it ends up that it turns out you can get a lot of information that way when you just communicate with someone, right? And so there are some of these skills that I think is what you're talking about, like collaboration, creativity, what we just call kind of grit or fortitude, right? Having a growth mindset. And these are the things that we've also got to be teaching our kids, because in this fast-paced learning environment where things are changing all the time, where industries are changing and just being unraveled and totally remade, um, our kids have got to be flexible. I I do believe they are going to be more flexible than me, right? I already feel it when I
I see it. I
yeah,
see it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you see it. They're going to be more flexible than us, but nevertheless, we want them to be flexible and long lasting. We don't want them to be schizophrenic
Right.
and just frenetic and running all over the place and like with no ability to kind of focus, because that focus is really important if you're going to actually get hard work done.
Yeah. So, the funny thing is, like you said, I literally said I see it. Well, I'm a lot older a parent than you. We have the same kids. We have the same. Our kids are almost the same ages, but I'm significantly older. I'm a significantly older parent. So my kids really maneuvering this world the way they are. When I'm calling them to help me with computer skills or something, it's kind of funny. But I do see an incredible change already. I'm just so anxious to see more, 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 more. And I see it when I talk to you that nothing I'm saying seems crazy or outlandish. And sometimes you even point out it's already happening. And I'm like, this is what I want to keep building on.
Yeah.
and we keep focusing on the negative, so no matter what party you're a part of, we keep beating the other party up for the past. I've said before, when it comes to just say COVID, the Democrats screwed the pooch. I got it, but just let's put that behind us. Let's start working together again, or
Right.
when it comes to whatever, I don't need to keep giving examples. That just builds on the momentum of why there's so much dissension. But um, on this podcast in particular, I'm always bringing on people that are great thinkers and want to implement so many things. And I just think we may have an opportunity this one time with this one, uh, I guess I would say crazy approaching president to get a lot done. His approach is a little haphazard. It's a little arcane, but we may have an opportunity to get a lot done. So let's get a lot done.
Yeah.
I don't know what's next. And I don't know that what's next will be able to be what they want to be when we say, hey, we saw this other guy doing swinging the bat really hard, and this is what came out good of it. So you need to start swinging the bat, or you're going to be voted out of office.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And in thinking about this federal tax credit program in particular, because
That
obviously
came from this administration?
that came from this administration. That was part of the one big bill. And and I'll tell you, that was a what 1,000-page bill. So I honestly I can't tell you what was in the rest of it.
No.
But I know about these 2 pages, and and I also know that if people participate and it raises the kind of money that it has the potential to nationally. I mean, you're talking about upwards of $20 billion added on top of what's already being spent in education, right? That could be used in ways that we can't even imagine. And so, I would say to my friends on the left who are really skeptical, maybe of or very skeptical of this administration and its motives, what have you, I'd say fine. You can be skeptical, but just know that this administration basically just opened the door. It's not going to direct how this $20 billion is spent. The $20 billion is going to be spent by families in ways that they need it, to build the education of the future for their kids. I don't know why you would turn your back on that, right? This is free money effectively coming your way. If you're a state like California, so Governor Newsom has, basically signaled that he doesn't want to participate. Okay, if you think you don't want to participate, cool. 1% of Californians participating is $100 million, $103 million. If you don't want $103 million to come on top of what's already being spent, for students in your state, you're crazy. Like that's insanity to me. So yeah, I think to your point, like put the partisan politics aside and just think about what these resources could do for students and the doors that it could open up for students. I mean, think about where you and I grew up. I was, you'll know this part of town. I was 2 blocks away from Garden City. Super nice area for folks who are not familiar with, this part of Long Island, this part of the country. Where I lived, not super nice. Um, those 2 blocks, it the the valley between the economic status could not be deeper or wider between Hempstead and Garden City. Um, there are so many kids for whom geography controls their educational destiny. That is not okay. And I don't care if you're Republican, I don't care if you're Democrat, Independent, whatever. Um, we have an opportunity to do something about that. And if it came because of a bill that you didn't love or a president that you don't care for, well, so be it. But like,
Make the best of it.
make the best of it. This is not just making lemonade. This is like, I don't know what's better than lemonade. Maybe a lot, but I think there's a lot of opportunity here.
No, it's huge. It really is. And I didn't know anything about it. And I think getting the word out that it's out there is a big part of what we're trying to accomplish, that this money is out there. I think it's out there. The legislation is passed. So
Yeah,
the money should
legislation's
be
passed.
accessible.
Yeah, so
So,
the start being raised basically next year. They're doing all the rulemaking and all that stuff now, and so they'll start technically they'll start raising and sending money out in 2027. But I'll send you some links, and maybe you can drop them in show notes and whatnot for people. But yeah, it's super exciting, and
yeah,
it's
please send me
happening.
those links because I'll forward them on to my assistant, my partner Laura, and we'll get them out there on this podcast as a part of that. And I want people to know about that because that's always what I said is I use the operative figure $50 billion. Let's give each state another $1 billion for education. Well, if we're starting at 20, that's a good start. I never thought we would get that high mark. I thought 50
Yeah.
was ridiculous, but throw it out there. But we're at 20 now. I mean, I think we're at 20 now, right? So we're 30-40% of the way there already with my
Yeah,
50 figure.
we'll get there. And listen, that'll spend 20 billion, that'll spend, You can do a lot
Yeah,
with that.
and it's a great, and I don't know the specifics of the big beautiful bill. It's 1,000 pages. I know why I know I I understand why there's contentious points to everything going on. For example, so I'm just going to use this as an example. Right now, I really think the reason the government's shut down is because of the Affordable Care Act subsidy, that they're going to pull back on the subsidy. The subsidy was increased for COVID. So I always use the example from where we're from. The subsidy was passed for COVID, and then Democrats just intended it to go on till eternity. Well, it's kind of like rent control. After World War II, we put in rent control, so returning soldiers from coming home from war would have a place to stay and understand rent and be able to pay rent for 2 years. But generally speaking, liberals made it permanent. So places like the South Bronx and Brooklyn and the South Bronx, New York, where these rent control buildings, they never increased the rent. So the owner said, I can't even pay the taxes anymore with the rent I'm receiving. So they
Right.
abandoned the whole area. So you've got this run down, burnt down community. So it's kind of like that. When you just keep adding on to social programs and you never pull back, there's not a lot of good that comes out of it. But when you invest in education, like we're doing now, you're going to get
Yep.
a lot of return on investment. And that's always
Yeah.
been how I came up with the figure $50 billion. It was like, let's just give each state another $1 billion. Yeah, some of it's going to be wasted. But you know what? A lot of good's going to come out of it too.
Yeah, and
So,
and I think one of the keys in my estimation, and what we'd say at AFC is you you empower parents to make those decisions, right? Like, because who's at the critical juncture in terms of making decisions for kids and students? It's parents. And I know, of course, there's going to be anomalies. There's going to be situations where some families are not able to do that, right? Where because of a family situation, um, you don't have parents who are just right there, kind of, with their hand on the switch. I get that, but by and large, I much prefer, right, you making a decision for your kids than I do someone, in your case, even in Tallahassee making that decision, or someone in Washington D.C. making that decision, right? Because parents are seeing things on a daily basis, right? They can assess things, and you don't have to be an expert in chemistry or calculus to make educational decisions for your kids. You can talk to other people. You can still have a partnership and that cooperation with educators, trained educators, and teachers, so you can get the information you need. But when parents are really empowered to make that decision, I think it's really, really powerful. And you also see that they are kind of enlivened when they have that agency, right? Because what happens now, I mean, you've got compulsory education. So what happens when anything is compulsory? Well, people start to devalue it. And so you say, well, I don't know. If it's compulsory, I have to go, which means you don't really have an incentive to make sure that the quality is super high because you know that I have to show up. Well, that's no way to run a high quality industry or organization or
no.
business or school. But that is how we run schools. And so we shouldn't be surprised when the quality in many places is just subpar. But again, I think there's reason for optimism. I think we inject this new federal program in. I'm optimistic that lots of Democratic governors are going to participate. So the governors have to opt in. So that's going to be the interesting thing. So I think most of your Republican governors will opt in. Democratic governors, I think some will, some won't. The ones that don't, the deal is that their taxpayers can still participate. So that example that I gave from California, if California doesn't want to participate, well, its taxpayers can still pay. They can just pay money into another state's scholarship organization. And so that again to me, you talk about no-brainers, like that's crazy. So if Gavin Newsom says we don't want to participate, he would basically be saying, all right, Californians with tax liability, you can send your money to Nevada or Arizona or whatever. Pick your state of choice. That's wild that you would export, hundreds of millions of dollars every year to somebody else's kids. So I think they'll participate, and I think, parents will be able to spend it and do a lot of cool things.
Well, and the funny thing about that is if that happens where people are actually being told your governor is not allowing you to use this money, but you can give it to someone else, I think the pressure will be on the governor to make the ultimate decision to allow them to use the money.
Yeah, I
So
think
that
you're right.
is a great momentum. That is a great incentive or a great way to put the bill together, maybe. To build on another point that to unpack something, like you said, when you think about the notion that where you live may dictate the kind of public education you get, which it does. I'm not saying we're not being ideological when we say that. It's a fact that like you said, where you lived, and then you go 6 blocks over, and that those schools looked entirely different, and the teachers had an entirely different approach. The fact that that happens, one of the things I always liked about the idea of building on an extra curriculum and maybe in our churches is that not only so there's parents that don't necessarily have valuable information to impart on their children, whereas if you go 6 blocks over, those parents really do understand a lot of good stuff that they can impart on their children. So these overall life skills classes would not only be the parents' option to allow their kids to go or to sign up for their kids would be going, so they would also have a sense of ownership in
Mm-hmm.
that class. They would
Mm-hmm.
be choosing to go, and it would be over and above the K through 12 education system, and it would be on the time when they may be spending playing video games.
Mm-hmm.
So, so I'm just big on all that, everything that's happening. I see it, recently I talked to a Banks Helfrich, candidate for Florida House, and he was saying how in my area they're building smaller schools and community-based smaller schools where kids are basically riding their bikes to schools versus busing. I mean, that's a great way to start your morning. Sometimes I start my morning riding my bike. That's a great way to start your morning, is that it kind of wakes you up, that fresh air and that bike ride. And so there's a lot of great stuff happening in education. And I can't talk about it enough. I used to say when I ran for office, I used to tell people because big thing about I ran as a Democrat really doesn't matter. I don't even know where I am anymore. I may just wind up being an independent soon. Um, but I used to say, I don't raise money, I raise awareness. And everybody thought I was an idiot, and basically they're like, you can't run for politics and not raise money. So I said, you know what? You're right. I can't
Yeah.
change that. That's impossible. But I can just focus on raising awareness. And that's what I do at this podcast is I just raise awareness. It's just no longer, I don't consider myself a political activist. Charlie Koch coined a phrase, a social entrepreneur. I feel like political activists ultimately run for office. Feel like I'm more of a Jesuit. I'm more of a scholar more than a leader. I
Mm.
want to just focus on learning from everybody that's on the show, continuing to learn, reading, and everything else that I do to learn more and more and more and more, and bring on great guests like you. And so with that, I don't know. I want to hear from you. I also do want those links, so you could email me those links so we can get that going because I want to keep building on that momentum that you have
Yeah.
this money available to you. And if your governor is saying, I don't think we're going to have that issue in Florida, but if you're in, I don't know, like you said, Gavin Newsom is going to stand on his laurels and say we're not taking the money. That may just change because the voters may tell him call
Yeah, you got to
bullshit.
do it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
but so um. I think I want you to wrap it up, Shaka. Go ahead and just tell me whatever's on your mind, and then
Yeah, well, no, thank you so much for having me on. And I mean, as we've been talking, I think there's no question that we've got to we've got to do better when it comes to how we educate our kids and how we deliver education across the country. That being said, I think the momentum is building and things are oriented in the right direction, and that's oriented in a way that gives more parents, greater flexibility. It's adding resources where they're needed and where they're best spent, which is not the folks who are pushing paper, but it's parents who can make the decision about, hey, what does my student need, this week, this month, this school year, and how can we do better? That federal tax credit program, like we said, I'll share links and you can share it with your audience and your network because that's going to be a game changer around the country. Billions of dollars are going to get added and used in some really innovative ways. And I would encourage people to ask questions. Again, you talk about raising awareness. I think part of that is listening and asking good questions. And I would say ask questions of your like state elected leaders. If you moved from another state or if you've got family in another state where they're doing something that's more innovative, ask your state leaders, hey, why aren't we doing that? Right? Because most education happens at the state level. It's state laws that govern most of this policy. Say, hey, I've got family in Florida. They've got all these options. Why don't we have options like that? Right? That is a valid question. If you're South Carolina just passed a law this year, and in part, I think they passed a law because Georgia and North Carolina, kind of their border states, both had programs that were doing this already. And so at some point, the folks in South Carolina said, hey, why are we lagging behind? That it doesn't make any sense. We are no longer the guinea pigs. Now we're the ones being left behind. And the other states are like, pulling away from us. So talk to your state legislators, ask them questions, ask them, you know, why haven't you tried these solutions, seem to be working and yielding great results in other places? But yeah, lots of reasons for optimism. Would love for folks if you want to check out our work, you can go to federationforchildren.org.
Oh,
And yes, federationforchildren.org. And I write about a bunch of this stuff, and my stuff is at Shaka's Substack. And so I've got a bunch of articles up there and kind of point you to some resources that are hopefully helpful for both policymakers, but also parents.
that is incredible. And just to build on this one last point, when children don't have mentors in their life, parents that can serve as mentors, we need to fill that void. And however we, in an unintrusive way, we need to fill that void. We need to offer at least an option to fill that void. And that's, like you said, we got parents that can impart a lot of important stuff to kids, and we got parents that just don't show up at all for those kids. So when there is that scenario where this child is just not being nurtured, not being cared for, we need to find a way to fill that void, and that's a big part of it too. So, I don't know how I think we're finding ways to do it and thinking about ways to do it, but you're doing incredible work. I'm gonna get right on this federationforchildren.org and your Substack as well. Definitely shoot me that email. This will be out in about I would say 10 week to 10 days because and I'll definitely get with you. I'll get with you and let you know it's out so you can take a look because it's been an incredible conversation. So this political no-brainer. Check us out. We're also kind of rebranding. The political no-brainer is going to be alive and well. We're creating a podcast that's chair across the aisle, so it's less political and more just like we did. There wasn't a lot of politics. There was some politics in what we did, but I don't want to imply that everything we do is political. So we're chair across the aisle is going to be the new the newly branded or
Love it.
another podcast.
Love
And
it.
we do Kids Quack, which is going to be a podcast for kids by kids, but that's coming up real soon too. So it's going to
Very
be
cool.
great. So thanks, Shaka. Thank you so much.
You bet. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
I'm looking forward to having you again. I don't. I'll stay in touch. I hope that'll be an option.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Shaka. Talk to you soon.
All
Thanks
right.
so
Take
much.
care.
That was an incredible conversation. Thank you.